Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're very excited to have Minnesota author Bill Strusinski with us this evening. A couple months ago, Tony called me and said, I saw this great author at the Winthrop Library, and we'd love to have him come and speak. And so I appreciate him reaching out. And I know the manager there at the Winthrop Library, Audra, and she spoke very highly as well about yes. So if you like programs like this, please let us know in future. We love having authors come and share about the writing, their experiences. And so, Bill, I will let you go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you. What an honor to be here. I didn't know you could have an event without Shell's beer sitting somewhere in the same room. Well, good evening. I'm Bill Strusinski, and I thank you. I want to thank Leroy for inviting me down here to share my story of my service to my country during the Vietnam War. Again, I'm Bill Strusinski. I live in Scandia, Minnesota with my wife, Kirsten Libby, who's back there. There's no better place to discuss democracy, freedom, and supporting the Constitution than this public library. When we no longer explore ideas that differ from our own, learning and growth have died. Libraries provide a safe environment for people to learn about complex subjects and to intelligently discuss ideas. Now, my journey to writing my book, my story, Care Under Fire, and my willingness to share my story has been a lifetime in the making. First, I had to experience a war. Then I had to learn how to manage my demons that followed me from the war zone. I decided to share my story to educate others about the nastiness of war and the true toll it takes on veterans. Is there any Vietnam veterans in the crowd today? All right. Any other medics? Oh, Tony's one. I got to be careful what kind of stories I tell. Or just somebody may have been there and understands the situation a little differently than I did. Anyhow, I decided to share my story about the nastiness of war and the impact it has on all veterans. Now, my book has obviously provided me with a platform to share this important role that all veterans play in keeping our country safe and free to pursue self-determination in the new world order. Besides, writing the book was very therapeutic for me. I was drafted into the Army in 1967, and I served as a combat medic with Company A, 1st Battalion, 26th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division in 1967 and 68. I was a blue spader from the 26th Regiment with the Big Red One. Everybody's heard about the Big Red One. Remember D-Day, Normandy Beach, and all that sort of stuff. I was proud to be part of that unit in Vietnam, a different war. I think it's important to teach all Americans about the value of military service and the sacrifices so many have made to defend freedom. Unfortunately, not many young people today are familiar with the Vietnam War. Now, as important, as impactful as that war was on my generation, civics classes today and teachings about the Vietnam War and freedom no longer seem to be a priority in many of our schools. And to me, that's just wrong. Now, I'd like to take you back in time. I'd like to take you back to the late 1960s. I want to transport you back mentally, at least, so you can make an emotional connection and better understand what it was like to be a soldier who was sent to Vietnam in defense of our country. I would like you to feel, or at least imagine, the things I experienced. Think about the nightly news from the battlefields of Vietnam that for the very first time showed the horrors of battle in every household in America. Think about the civil rights protests. There were a lot of them. Think about the anti-war protests. There were many of them. And the protesters who misdirected their anger on returning soldiers who were just doing their job. And think about the Kent State shootings that killed and wounded several innocent college kids because they were protesting the war. Now that you're back in the late 60s and 70s, it may be easier to relate to my story. As Douglas MacArthur reminded us so many years ago, the soldier above all others prays for peace. For it's the soldier who must suffer and bear the deepest wounds and scars of war. Now we all know in war, soldiers die, and numerous others are wounded in battle. However, it's important to note that too many veterans will suffer and die years later after they left the war zone as a result of service-connected illnesses or injuries like exposure to Agent Orange or PTSD. And far too many veterans in general are homeless. Perhaps this is just one reason to recognize that all veterans, military personnel, and their families are forever affected by the memories earned in combat. Of course, we remember those that died, who went to war and never came back. We do celebrate them on Memorial Day. But we must remember all who came back but were never quite the same again. For many, their bodies came home from Vietnam, but their minds never did. Many veterans live with the horrors of war every day, and far too many have committed suicide as the final solution to their finding peace. Do you know in Minnesota, 135 veterans a year commit suicide? That's way too high. And a lot of them are older veterans. Or thinking about things at home now that are retired that they should have processed years ago but didn't. Now, while we may forget about the politics that led our country into the war, our country must never forget those who answered the call. That, by the way, is one of the major lessons we learned from the Vietnam War. You would think we did, but we've had Afghanistan and Iraq and a few other wars since then. I hate snakes. Was that a cobra I just killed? Why is it so hot? Will it ever stop raining? How many days left in country? Will I be brave? Does it hurt when you get shot? Will I make mom and dad proud? Are we really patriots? Lord, don't let me screw up. Why do firefights seem like organized chaos with lots of noise and carnage? Did someone yell, medic? Where's my morphine pack? Where the hell's that medevac dust-off? Why is it so difficult to erase the memories of taking someone's life in combat, whose job it was to take yours? Remember to pull the pin before you throw the damn grenade. A sucking chest wound really does suck. When it came to sutures, the baseball stitch was my favorite. Wow, my training didn't prepare me for this. Now, in sorting through my recollections of Vietnam, I prepared this list of expressions to sum up my experiences. Each reference communicates some aspect of my story in concise terms, covering 366 days in a combat zone. Yes, I got stuck there in leap year, one extra day. These declarations run the gauntlet of my experience and summarize my feelings. Now, as they say, I survived my time in hell. I gathered wisdom and I learned to understand what it means to be courageous. I felt the burdensome pain of worry and the full effects of misery and heartache. I did things and I experienced things that most young adults can't begin to envision. Perhaps I should not. Now, in case you didn't know, the Vietnam War was the first time medics were directly embedded into infantry units. In previous wars, medics served near the front and went into action after the fact. Having a medic on patrol with a very small combat unit was specifically designed to save lives. The goal was to render aid as soon as the battle injury occurred. This new Army protocol did save many lives from people that would have likely died in previous wars. But you can't talk about Vietnam without talking about some of the statistics about the war. And I like to share these because it's important to underscore them and to show to people just how nasty the war really was for those of us who were there. Total killed in action, 58,319. Missing in action, 1,719. Wounded in action, 303,635. Combat medics like me killed in Vietnam, 1,247. The average age of a soldier in Vietnam was 19 years old. And 1 out of every 10 Americans who served in Vietnam was a casualty. Amputations and crippling wounds like that are 300% higher than they were during World War II. And as a result, more than 106,000 Vietnam veterans were totally disabled. Medevac helicopters, the famous dust-off, flew 500,000 missions. And interesting to note, the average infantryman in the South Pacific during World War II saw about 40 days of combat in 4 years. The average infantryman in Vietnam saw about 240 days of combat in 1 year, thanks to the mobility of the helicopter and the guerrilla tactics employed by the enemy. We didn't have big lines, big battles, people weren't lined up. It was a different kind of war. And finally, 19.4 million gallons of Agent Orange defoliant was sprayed in Vietnam. This act alone made sure that hundreds of thousands of exposed Vietnam veterans would forever suffer and remember their tour of duty. Now, I know the anxieties and the difficulties of making some very tough decisions in combat. Medics know about life, death, and healing. And later on, many of us learn how to live with PTSD. While doing our best, we had to make too many difficult decisions about treating a casualty. That's a lot to bite off for a 19 or 20-year-old. But making tough decisions is in a medic's DNA. It was our mission and our legacy, and yet these decisions gave us comfort and confidence whenever we could save a life. Most importantly, learning to process these decisions became a medic's mental salvation. If you remember anything I say here tonight, remember this. Those who serve our country and protect our country, it's really important to understand. In war, there are no unwounded soldiers. In war, there are no unwounded soldiers. Everybody was affected. Now, the Go Army recruiting website, today if you take a look at it, the Go Army recruiting website states, while there are other healthcare positions available in the Army, you would be hard-pressed to find a military occupation as exciting and dangerous as that of a combat medic. The website goes on to explain, while any enlistee with the willingness and aptitude can become a combat medic, ideally these candidates will possess strong communication skills, empathy, attention to detail, have the ability to handle lots of stress under the most trying of circumstances, and be risk takers. That's how they advertise the job for the Army on the website. Be risk takers. Now, I never saw a hospital in Vietnam. I spent my year in the bush. Almost every day I was on patrol. I pulled roughly 200 daytime patrols, which were called search and destroy missions, and more than 60 very dangerous, I think, ambush patrols at night. All Vietnam veterans envisioned themselves as proud members of the RBA club, a real badass club. And some of us still think we're real badass today, but probably not. Typically, as a medic, my job went something like this. Stop the bleeding. Yes, but how? My battle dressing seems so inadequate. IV? I can't get it started. We're still under fire. Pain, how do I manage the pain? Morphine. Yes, I could give them morphine. Not breathing? Try mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Didn't work? Say a little prayer and tender his care to the Lord, and then move on to the next soldier. Chaos, bombs, gunshots, lots of noise, and smoke and the smell of carnage. But you're the medic, so handle it. Get him on the dust-off, which is a medical evacuation helicopter, and say a little prayer. God, I hope he makes it. You know, if we got somebody on the helicopter alive, then 92% of the chance they would survive. That was an important first couple of hours. When the gunfire subsides, you engage your brain and think about your next steps. It's a learned skill. You care for the injured all the while, making sure that you do your best to help your brother survive the situation. Sometimes it worked out, and unfortunately, sometimes it did not. As a medic, no matter the chaos and confusion that is happening around you, you somehow remain focused on doing your job. Out of necessity, you unselfishly respond to the anguish call, medic, and you cautiously advance to the scene of the injury, understanding that the perpetrator of the bloodshed, that sniper, may still be present. but I'm a pretty smart fellow. I quickly learned always to take the M60 machine gunner with me to lay down and field the fire while I did my job. Your adrenaline kicks in and you take charge of the situation. I had to move them across the perimeter to the flank, to the point wherever it was, the casualty. I had to move up there and get him, but I never went alone. Grady, my M60 guy, was with me all the time. Now, for stealth and speed, we traveled as light as possible. All my supplies fit into an aid bag, which weighed about 12 pounds. The contents of my aid bag included 5 morphine syrettes, 1 bottle of saline solution, 1 bottle of lump albumin, a snake bite kit, malaria pills, iodine, salt tablets, compressed battle dressing, some petroleum gauze for dressings for sucking chest wounds, elastic ace wraps, clamps, sutures, tourniquets, an air passage tube, a stethoscope, and a generous supply of pills and ointments. Carried it all. I also carried a rope, a bayonet, an M16, 6 magazines for my rifle, 1 claymore mine, 2 hand grenades, 4 canteens of water, and 1 flashlight complete with color filters. That's why they called us a combat medic. In just 1 year, I dealt with poisonous snake bites, scorpion stings, scrapes, scratches, puncture wounds, dysentery, fire ant bites, hepatitis, infections from leeches and centipedes, jungle rot, broken bones, toothaches, punji stick wounds, gunshot wounds, shrapnel wounds, traumatic stress syndrome, landmine injuries, and burns. I did suturing, I did mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, I administered morphine and applied splints, and once immobilized and treated a broken back victim. I also dealt with attempted suicides and treated a couple of non-life-threatening self-inflicted pistol wounds, where these soldiers were determined to get out of Vietnam in the Army, but in actuality all they ever succeeded doing was taking a couple of toes off their foot. And too often I acted as a counselor whenever personalities clashed. I don't know why, guys always trusted the medic. We didn't have a chaplain in the field, but they trusted the medic and they bring problems to us. So I acted as a counselor whenever personalities clashed, alcohol-induced disagreements surfaced over a poker game usually, or when one of the guys got a Dear John letter. In fact, I called myself a jungle therapist. And it seemed to me that the soldiers would rather take their problems and have me talk with them through their problems and their personal problems than to seek counsel and advice from the first sergeant. You know what kind of advice he was going to get. I also treated an assortment of maladies, afflictions for Vietnamese civilians whenever I set up sick call when our patrol passed through a village. These medical missions were called civic action patrols, and the people were very wonderful. They were just wanted to be left alone. They were farmers for the most part, at least where I was. But these patrols were designed to show to the Vietnamese civilian population that we were indeed the good guys. I probably even treated some Viet Cong and didn't know it, some of those villages. Now, for me and many other veterans, you'll appreciate this, it would be dishonest to state that the length of service, our length of service, was calculated by the number of years we served in uniform. It would be more accurate to measure, a more accurate measurement if we included in the calculation the years we spent reliving our experiences. When I was drafted, I was told I had to give the Army 2 years. However, my mind and my body has been dealing with war-related issues for over 50 years. In reality, all of us who are in the service were sentenced to serve a lifetime of military service through remembering, at least, or I have Agent Orange-related issues myself. Some combat memories never fade, and for many of us, battles will be fought and reflected upon till our last breath. I've challenged my mind to change the outcome of certain traumatic events because I still think what could have been. Unfortunately, these memories earned from a war-induced trauma do not fade, and the outcome was always the same. After several years, however, I did accept these lessons acquired in combat so I can move forward in my own life. Now, soldiers are trained to fight, but medics are trained to put broken soldiers back together. And over the years, I've been told by many combat veterans that there was comfort in knowing a medic was also on patrol to render aid should the unimaginable happen. Comfort to an infantry soldier was knowing the doc had your back. comfort to a medic was knowing that my brothers always had mine. And I can honestly tell you that I was always afraid to go into combat, but I knew I could count on my brothers to do their best to protect me. This sacred bond between rifleman and medic is very special, and this bond endures forever. Now, my 10 weeks of formal Army emergency medical training did not adequately prepare me for the challenges I would encounter in Vietnam. How could it? They couldn't tell you how to deal with the emotional side of it or anything. There is no way you can possibly explain or train a medic to deal with all the injuries you would encounter, let alone train you how to deal with your adrenaline and get it under control so you can think clearly and make good decisions about treatment. But the Army has a solution for everything. For us, it meant a lot of learn as you go and add this to your on-the-job training portfolio. Learning how to deal with the emotional stress and chaotic aspects of combat is a developed skill that can only come from on-the-job training. Combat was both mental and physical. You experience complete exhaustion, but you also learn skills and gain perspective, which leads to an increased confidence. You develop a special mental toughness that all veterans will take to the grave. My experiences in Vietnam as a combat medic made an enormous difference in my life. I know all about resilience, and I like to believe that I was able to turn adversity into something positive. My experiences in Vietnam taught me just how fragile life is, that we are not immortal, and nothing should ever be taken for granted. My experiences in Vietnam most definitely helped me transition from my teenage years to adulthood. I put away the things of a child and took up the instruments of war. I learned how to render medical emergency care under fire. And like so many others, I did these things in defense of my fellow soldiers and my country, and I did it all before my 22nd birthday. My experiences taught me that there is no obstacle too difficult to overcome. My experiences taught me that we can always do more than we think we can. You can never give up. You had no choice. You had to keep moving forward. I believe in my experiences in Vietnam taught me the importance of turning post-traumatic stress into post-traumatic strength. Upon full reflection, my experiences did change me for the good. They gave me the confidence necessary to confront and overcome the everyday challenges we face in life. My experiences proved beneficial as I made my way through the difficulties of raising a family, performing work tasks to the best of my ability, and doing good by supporting my community. And finally, my experiences in Vietnam taught me why it's so important for us to be good citizens and to get along. I was honored to render care to some soldiers in some pretty extreme conditions. For me, I think my time in Vietnam was worth every moment. Perhaps this conviction is really simple. Maybe I ended up being in the wrong place, but I like to believe, I know it's true. For some of the soldiers, I was there at the right time. And like so many others, I came home to another hostile environment. Protesters greeted us at the airport, and shouts of baby killer still linger and hurt my soul. Our country was divided and the bitterness prevailed. I knew I had changed, but I longed to come home to a country whose people could put aside differences. And Martin Luther King was assassinated when I was in Vietnam. So was Bobby Kennedy, assassinated when I was in Vietnam. And my mother kept the letters that I wrote home. In those letters, I was questioning her, why are you killing Americans back home? We're protesting or civil war over these issues. And we're in a war zone. What are you doing back home? It took its toll on soldiers emotionally. We didn't like that stuff. I know, again, that I longed for a country whose people could put aside their differences. I still do. Like so many other events, I did learn to accept the frustrations of society and realize that we had a lot of work to do to heal our nation. We still do. Democracy will always be a work in progress, and soldiers will be needed to assure that we, the people, are afforded the opportunity to govern ourselves regardless of the quality of that governance. We're still going to govern ourselves. If we want to preserve our freedoms, we must put them into action. We need to speak out against injustice, and we have a duty to vote in elections. Everyone deserves to enjoy the benefits of freedom. We volunteer in our communities. We lead by example. And we realize we have an obligation to teach our children just what it really means to be an American. While our country can never give us back what we've lost in protecting it, a grateful nation will always be thankful for the sacrifices we made. God bless all of you for loving our country and for understanding what it takes to be a true patriot. Look after our homeless veterans, and for those who are still dealing with the scars of war, contact Steve Peterson at the VSO office if you know a veteran in crisis. And may God bless America. Leroy, thanks for inviting me here tonight.
Open for questions?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
Any questions? I answered all the questions on the Vietnam War. Tony?
We talked a little bit at Winthrop, and you signed the book, Care Under Fire, for me, and I brought it home. And my wife opened it up, and I kind of pointed to the signature that you wrote on there. And one thing that you wrote in there, because I'm a medic, you wrote in there, 220 Doc. Question, what's in it? And she says, why do you call you Doc? I said, I thought I told you this. She came from a family that didn't have any veterans in it or anything. I said, as a medic, I looked at it as your unit called you Doc because you were the ones they look forward to now. I'm not even going to come close to the kind of experiences that you had. I was a medic at peacetime, during peacetime, and I never was shot at, ever. Except in basic training, I take that back.
You were hollered at by the first sergeant, I bet. So.
But she said, well, why do you write Doc? And I said, all of us medics have the experience with our units. They looked at us as Doc because they looked at us for everything. In my case, most of it was bumps and bruises, and I didn't have to worry about the psychology, the psychological aspects. But I said, well, she said, well, how come every movie that I've seen, every time you talk about it, they always say medic. I said, that is an international term for anybody knows. If you call for a medic, you're not going to call for a doc because that's for your personal unit. I think she understands now, but it's kind of ironic that when you sign that on there, I said, from one medic to another, you'll probably call another medic doc, but you may not hear that from other soldiers that were in other units. They say we called for the medic, we called for the medic. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I appreciate, like I said, like I told you before, I'm up to chapter 6 now. And that's the most chapters I've read in any book for the last 25 years. I still got a ways to go.
Well, I'm glad it prompted you to read. You get books here at the library. You're right, the perfect spot.
That's right.
Yes.
So thank you for your time.
You're welcome. Kirsten.
So Bill, you talked about what the website says today for Army recruitment of medics. Why don't you tell the story about how you chose to be a medic and what your training involved and how you got to Vietnam?
Well, yes, okay, I'm happy to do that. By the way, all medics are pretty well referenced to as doc when you're in infantry, particularly. Even a general calls you doc. And I'd go, okay, general, you still got to take your malaria pills or whatever. I still would tell them what to do. Anyhow, we're all grateful for each other. So I got drafted, and I went to St. Paul, the Armory, and got on a bus, got out to the airport, and they took me to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Those of you in the service, you know that the first thing you do is they bring you to the introductory billets, and they start giving you a battery of tests. And they say, well, at least the draftees, what do you want to be? What kind of job do you want? You want to be infantry? I said, no, it's not a good, I know what that was all about. You want to be artillery? Shoot big cannons. I said, a lot of noise, I don't want that. You want to be a cook? I know how to cook. Do you want to be a truck driver? I know how to drive a truck. How about being a medic? Because I figured if I learn emergency first aid, it'll be worthwhile, the rest of my life. At least I must learn something while I'm here. So I want to be a medic. Oh, good. Thank you so much for volunteering to be a medic. And just for that, I want you to know that typically medics end up going to school, Sam Houston down in Texas, nice place to visit, and you'll probably get assigned to a hospital in Germany or Italy. I'm glad I signed up for the right job. So here I'm in AIT, Advanced Individual Training, down at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. And come graduation day, they give you your orders along with your personnel file. Because that's when you move to the military, you always take your records with you so you can get paid at the next duty station, at least. So graduation ceremonies, I look at my orders and it says Company A, 1st to 26th, 1st Infantry Division, Vietnam. So I went to the first sergeant, I says, what hospital in Italy is this, or Germany? He said, son, you're an infantry medic, you're going straight to Vietnam from here. You'll be on the patrol every day. I said, oh, but here it says on my 208 file, that's what we carry. It says stamped in big letters across the front of my file, says not qualified for combat duty in big red letters. I said, what about this? Where's my hospital now? He looks at it here. Well, you've got bad eyes, you need glasses. He says, give this guy 4 pair of glasses, he told his aide, and he says, give him one of them sunglasses. He says, son, we never give sunglasses to the infantry guys, just so you know that. So off I went to Vietnam. And I was proud, and they teach you right away. You go to your unit, the 1st Infantry Division, and it had a rich, storied history, still does, of course. And I was proud of that, and I learned a lot more about the history. But that's how I got to Vietnam. And I was surprised. Never did see a hospital in Germany or Italy, and never saw a hospital since I got out of training out of Fort Sam Houston, Texas. And interesting enough, there's a new book out called The Women, about nurses in Vietnam. Have you read that? And I did the foreword for a Vietnam veteran nurse. In her book, it's called On the Record. Faye Farrington's her name, and I did the foreword in her book. When I read her manuscript, my publisher asked me to do this, write this introduction. I had no idea whatever happened to casualties once I put them on the helicopter. I had no idea where they went. They would tell me if the guy didn't make it, and they were all men in those days, there were no women. I think we're better off having women in the military now. But I never knew where they went. But then they started reading these diaries and reading the book of the women. Now you get a good feeling for what happened to my casualties afterwards. And I think they had a tougher job. I mean, I had to deal with the situation. I had to go out under fire and do those kinds of things and run around and do crazy stuff and get this person stabilized so I can get them on a helicopter and get them out of there. But then they went after the person to help them heal. What sometimes is a long, long process, years sometimes, and sometimes never. But those women, and most of the women in those days, nurses, had to deal with all of that. And so I was so honored to know what happened to them afterwards to my care. It's kind of interesting. You hear this all the time today. Everybody in the military has their own little role. And you don't know what the other person does necessarily, but it all fits together like a puzzle, particularly in combat units. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, how did you manage to put this book together?
Good question. 2 things. Number one, I'm a lobbyist. Still working at the state capitol. Has since I graduated from college. I've been at the Capitol for 52 years. This will be session 52 coming up next year. And I work with public television. And they had a program called Minnesota Remembers Vietnam a few years ago. Ken Burns series, they did that series. And I helped them secure money from the legislature for that program. And I ended up testifying quite a bit before committees, legislative committees, asking them for funding for this program. And so that brought back a lot of memories and started thinking about this more. And then I was asked by the emergency medical ambulance people, EMTs and paramedics, to speak at their Stars of Life banquet one night. And I thought they wanted me to talk about how to get along with the legislature, because it was in St. Paul and they had a day on the Hill and at the Capitol and stuff. So I says, sure, I'll talk to you about that stuff, about how to get involved in politics and what to do when you get to the Capitol. And they said, no. We heard you were a combat medic in Vietnam. We want to hear that story. So I said, let me think about that. So I thought about it for about a week, and I said, yeah, I'll do it. And I had some time to start preparing my remarks, and I wanted to make sure to test my recollections to make sure they were accurate. And I figured if anybody understood my story, it would be those people, because who are you gonna call when you're first on the scene? Can't call the doctors, they're the ones that sent you there, right? The emergency medical. So they know what I went through. They might not have been shot at the same time, but they know what you went through, they know the trauma and the heartache. And so I gave that speech, and I developed a lot of material for my book. I started writing, and I just kept going with it. I got back, because when I made the presentation, for the first time I talked about this stuff in a significant way, that was probably 8 years ago, 6 years ago, it led to my story, led me to write it. It felt good. I gave my presentation that day, and they all stood up and applauded. They said, welcome home. And they gave me one of the Stars of Life awards that they give to their own members every year, who were demonstrated significant on treating injured people. And I was so flattered by that. So I continued with my story. And I wrote it all out, probably within a year, and then found a publisher to publish the book. That's how I got it out there. And I found it very therapeutic, because all of us were there. You know, you have memories, and you want to share your story. My story is no more important than anybody else who served in Vietnam. I was flattered in 2021, my book, Care Under Fire, did win the Independent Book Publishers Award for Best Military Nonfiction Novel, 2021. I was honored by that. But I want you to know that the accolades and any recognition I received all belongs to anybody who served in the service. I just happened to write my story out. But there's such a renewed interest in this stuff nowadays. And it's good. It's healing. It's therapeutic for us. It's therapeutic for the country to know what we went through. I wanted people to know that soldiers are the ones that defend the Constitution. They defend the document. They don't defend the president or a congressman or anything. We defend the document. So I came home to protesters. I'd tell them, you want to change your laws of government? You don't like what they are? The soldiers are the one that gave you that right to change the laws. We're defending the document, not President Johnson or anybody else. We defend your right to change the laws. That's how we look at it. So more people need to understand that. That's an important lesson. So that's how I wrote my book, and it's obviously given me a platform to talk about some of these things, which are, I think, important to all of us as American citizens. So thank you for the question. Yes?
Thank you for sharing with us. I was wondering, did you get to stay with Grady the whole time?
Yeah, I did. He and I got there about the same time. So Grady, the M60 guy, we were there about the whole length of service. In fact, even after we rotated back to the States, I went to Fort Carson, Colorado, and he went there too. So no M60 machine guns, but we were good friends at Fort Carson, Colorado. But yeah, it's interesting because, you know, it's just hard to describe the chaos. You know, when a firefight breaks out, it's just spontaneous. You have no idea. There's snipers in the trees and whatever, and everybody's down. You feel yourself. Those who have been in combat, you know, no bullet holes. I'm okay. I'm laying on the ground. Things are nice. Everybody's returning fire, right? You're a hard target to hit because you're on the ground in prone position. But then somebody hollers medic. Well, guess what? I had to go get up and start running around and kind of end up drawing a little bit of fire towards yourselves, I should say. But we survived. I was very blessed. I never got injured. I couldn't believe it. I've had dirt thrown in my face by machine guns that killed the guy next to me. The bullets were on the ground. That was my first casualty. He saved my life that night. His name was Salvo, on a patrol in September 1967. And he saw a machine gunner behind a berm. We were in the middle of a clearing working our way through across this field. And he said, hit it, Doc. Well, we both dove down, and the machine gun burst in front of us, threw dirt in my face, bullets ricocheted over my head. He got hit with one of them. He died that night. And I'll never forget how hard it was to be in the open, no cover. Everybody's returning fire, of course. We had a fair amount of firepower. But laying on top of that guy and shooting him up with morphine, because he kept wanting to get up and charge and run around. He was hurt really bad. And I'll never forget that incident that night, September of '67, because he saved my life. He saw them. He saved my life, and I couldn't save his. And I had difficulty dealing with that decision for a while, for a week or so. And finally, my first sergeant came to me and he says, look it, Doc, you didn't shoot him. He wasn't your brother. You did the best you could. You got him out of there. It wasn't your fault that he died. Now get over it, or you're not going to be worth a damn to the rest of these guys, the rest of your tour of duty here in Vietnam. And I'll yank you out of the field and get you out of the Army. Okay, that's what I needed, the kick in the ass to get over my sorrow and over my concerns, move forward. So I went on a little bit farther than that, but that was my story that night anyhow. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead.
Oh, great.
What interaction did you have with the Vietnamese people?
Yeah, it was interesting because we were at our base camp very rarely. I mean, we were out in the field one time for 119 days straight. I remember 119 days. But typically, the Vietnamese people, I thought were really nice people. I mean, they were farmers. And I was in rural Vietnam up near the Cambodian border. We were just a few clicks, as they say. In other words, a few thousand meters from Laos or Cambodia. And we went into Cambodia a few times on patrol. But the Vietnamese people in the mountainards, which are people who wore loincloth and are much shorter, they're indigenous people to Vietnam, they're in the Highland village. Wonderful people. They just wanted to be left alone. They wanted to live life, farm their crops and raise their rice and families like anybody else. So when I had a chance to interact with them on a civic action patrol and provide medical treatments for them, it was wonderful. I felt really good about all of that stuff. And that's why I came back from Vietnam, and as a result of those kinds of experiences, and I kind of had a belly full of medicine at that time. I thought about re-enlisting in the Army, but they told me I would probably serve another tour of duty with the infantry in Vietnam, and I said, absolutely not, I'm out of here. And I had $10,000 as a re-enlistment bonus in cash sitting at a table in front of me. And when you only make $2,000 a year, that was a lot of money. But I wasn't going to go back. I did my time in the barrel. But because of working with the Vietnamese people and some other incidents, I decided to get a degree in political science. Went back to Mankato. I had 2 years at Mankato before I went into service. And by 1969, I'm back on campus at Mankato State. And got a degree in political science and got involved in government and politics. My goal was to change the public policy, the things that got us into war to begin with. That was my aspiration. And I spent a lot of years in state government. I've been on governor's staffs. I've been commissioner of administration for the state of Minnesota. I've been blessed in my career, my whole life. I love it. It's been really wonderful. But those people brought me to that kind of realization that they needed help too. And while I mentioned,
Thank you for us and also from the Vietnamese people for being there.
well, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was my honor. And besides that, I got drafted. I had no damn choice in the matter, right? All of us who got drafted in those days, I mean, my dad was in World War II, and all my uncles were in the Navy and the Army and whatever, came back and stuff. That's just, I grew up on the east side of St. Paul, and that's just what you did. Your time to go into service, you did it. Didn't think twice about it or trying to. Vietnam War was sort of, we knew about it, but it wasn't quite as pronounced as it was later on in the 60s and 70s. But that's what we did. And those are important lessons to all of us. Yes, you had a question.
How many soldiers were in your unit, and were you the only medic for the?
Interesting. That's why I always thought the statistic 1,247 medics killed in Vietnam was a high number just for Army medics. Each company, our company's strength in the Army was, we could muster maybe 90 guys, 88 guys for patrol. That would be a company size. And there were 4 medics for the company. So each platoon, broken down into 4 platoons, each platoon had a medic. And there were 3 squads of 10, theoretically, in each platoon. So I had responsibilities initially for a platoon size worth, and I eventually became senior aide man, so I was overall the senior medic for the whole company. But what's as interesting is that if you think about three squads and 3 really combat platoons that took turns ambush patrols at night, right? You come in, you dig in a perimeter, you got to go out and set up listening posts, and you have to go out and set up an ambush patrol, and you're bait. You're the one that's out there. We didn't have satellites and things to determine reconnaissance. You were the first line of defense, so that if the enemy was coming towards the perimeter, because they knew where you were all the time, then they had to go through the ambush patrol, the listening posts. But what always frustrated me, there's an interesting story about this, is that every 3rd night, because there are three squads per platoon, and there's 9 squads overall with the thing, every 3rd night, I had to go out as a medic on ambush patrol. every ninth night, the infantry guys went on ambush patrol, because it was their turn. They had enough to rotate every night. I had to go out every third night, so I pulled over 60 of them. And it's show you how crazy it is. The 1st Division sent somebody out to interview me as a medic about ambush patrols, how to do them better and everything else, because I had more experience than anybody in the infantry. I was just blown away by that. I said, "Whoa, who's making these decisions? You're talking to the medic about ambush patrols." Yeah, it's interesting. Good question. So there was not many of us. That number I referenced does not include corpsmen who worked with the Marine Corps or Navy or anything else. That's just Army medics. So it's a lot. Yes, sir.
You said you encountered protesters. Was this at the airport? Where did this happen?
Yeah, of course, I'm coming back now. I came back in August of 1968. And we landed in California, and there were protesters. We had to get off the airport. I think it was Travis. And we had to go through the gate to get in the public road and then drive down to some other post where they separated us from and go home on leave and stuff like that. And there were protesters greeting the bus at 2 o'clock in the morning when we got off. They were throwing tomatoes and rocks and everything else at the bus. The buses had screen protection for all the occupants so that they couldn't throw. That's what we had in Vietnam too, so the enemy couldn't throw hand grenades in if you were ever going to Saigon. I did a couple of times. So that was the first encounter. So then you have your meal, get separated out of the army, or out of go home on leave, I should say. And then when I got to the airport in St. Paul, same thing, protesters. There were Hare Krishnas in those days. I'm not sure if they were protesters or what, but they kept trying to sell you stuff. Get out of here. But there were protesters, and they're calling your names. And it was very hurtful. I mean, I just came back from a combat zone. I wasn't mad at anybody. I was frustrated. I was obviously quite a responsibility in the service, but I just unfortunate. I was really sad to come home to experience all of that. Their anger was misguided, the protesters. And I can tell you, I've got 2 letters since I wrote the book. People who wrote to me and said, "I read your book, and my husband committed suicide. I didn't know why. He was a Vietnam vet, never talked about it. Now I have a little bit better understanding." And then another woman, so that was good. And another woman wrote and said, "I was one of those protesters you talked about. Called you baby killers. I greeted you." And she says, "I'm 70. She's 80 years old now. And she says, "I so apologize to you and all your veterans. You totally opened my eyes to how bad, how hurtful it was, our remarks were to you, and how misguided they were, misdirected they were. They should have been directed to the President of the United States and Congress. They're the ones who can change those laws. We were just doing our job." So it was a very unpleasant experience. And even back on college campus at Mankato, I did a workshop down there last November. Kirsten I was down there for half a day. They used my book in a couple of the classes, and they were talking about the Vietnam War in general, and did a workshop for 300 people, actually. And we talked about that, and they said, "How did you handle protesters and stuff back on campus, and did you ever encounter being called baby killer on campus?" I said, "Yeah. I mean, I'm 22, and I'm trying to date some young lady who's 19 or whatever, just got out of high school, and she's in classes with me. She called me a baby killer when she found out I was a Vietnam veteran. Wouldn't go out with me because I was a baby killer." I said, "Where do you get that? I didn't kill any babies. I don't know any veterans that killed any babies. Where do you get that?" I think it was because of the My Lai incident, Lieutenant Calley, who just died recently, and all those civilians he killed and his unit killed. Wasn't very far from me where that happened, or My Lai. But I think that's where that came from. But it was very hurtful. So rather than just be mad at her, I sat down and explained it to her. I saved lives. Why would you call me a baby killer? You have no idea what you're talking about. Learn something. Take some of these classes and learn something about life and about people and who defended you and your right to be here and protest. Long answer to your question, I'm sorry.
Were you prepared when you got off that would be this seat of the protesters?
What I was saying, what?
Yeah, were you prepared when you came home that there'd be these protesters?
They told us about it, but
Oh,
I mean, they just mentioned it, but it's like war. You can't imagine what it's like to experience it. Most people shouldn't experience either one. Protests today, they can't hold a candle to what the protests were back in the 60s. Remember those? early 70s, the race riots, the protests, Vietnam War protests. It was awful in our country. And to be a returning veteran who just trying to do your job was very painful. So we all clammed up. Nobody said anything for years. Just get about your business, raise your family, as I mentioned. Do your work, deal with your demons in your own way. Nobody else wanted to hear about them. Other questions? Boy, Leroy, you're right. The people of New Ulm are really smart. They ask good questions.
The medevac helicopters, once a soldier was on the helicopter, how much of a flight was it to get additional help? Hour, 5 hours?
No, I think what happened is again, if I got them on a helicopter alive, and most of them I got on a helicopter alive, they had 92% chance of survival because within 10, 15 minutes they would be at someplace that could triage them and take care of their wounds
Okay.
in a much better way. I mean, my job was to stop the bleeding.
Yeah.
I could never get an IV started, I'll tell you the truth. I've talked to a lot of medics about it. It's hard to do because you're in those situations and you're still being shot at half the time. And sometimes it was nighttime. I remember trying to start an IV while still under fire with a red filter in my flashlight. Couldn't get it in the arm. I was trained how to do an IV in the ankle if you had to. Couldn't get it either. That person was in shock. I was in shock. You're still under fire. Give them some morphine and stop the major battle wound this time, slow the bleeding down and get them the hell out of there. That was an ambush patrol at night that I had to go out and rescue because they got hit and they lost 3 guys that night. One of them was the medic. And I had to go out with a rescue patrol that night to get them. Longest night of my life. And that was around November 1967, the first Battle of Loch Ninh. And we had to go out, we had a firefight going on because the perimeter was hit. We had several casualties there, took care of business there, and the doctor comes to me and says, we got to go out and rescue that patrol. What are you going to do? You're the senior aid man. I said, well, I'll go out there too. And we'll get them. I took 2 more medics with me. He didn't say anything. He just take them with you. And I took hard litters. Instead, we carried soft litters. So I said the battalion aid station was there because the doctor was always a battalion-sized operation. So I took hard litters out, and we had to go out about half hour, 40 minutes to get to this people, and there's still shooting all the way out there, recon by fire. Get to the scene of the carnage, started trying to treat these people. We did the best we could and got them on these hard litters and carried them back. And I'll never forget coming back and still under some fire occasionally, carrying people up and down over trees at nighttime. This is 3 o'clock in the morning. That was the hardest thing I ever did. My guy, the one, he didn't make it, he died. But we still carried him back. We never left anybody behind. We took care of our brothers. And that sacred bond is so true. You just do what you gotta do. You'd be surprised how easy it is to risk your life. Because that's what you do in this situation. You gotta take care of business. But that was a hard, long night to get back in, and I'll never forget that night. 2 days later, we were in a battle. First Battle of Loch Ninh, November 7th, 1967. And it was a battalion-sized operation. That meant our battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel, who was a World War II guy, because this is 20 years later. And he's on patrol with them, and so was the command sergeant major for the battalion, and so was his executive officer. There were 2 companies, B and C, on a patrol. We knew it was a heavily concentrated enemy was in the area because they were getting ready for Tet. The enemy was up in our area preparing their siege into Saigon. We were the conduit, the funnel to get to Saigon was through our area, the 1st Infantry Division. And on that patrol that day, our company, my platoon at least, was pulling flank duty about 1,000 meters away on the side trying to protect the flank of those 2 companies on patrol. Well, they pushed through a clearing and they got to the edge of the thicket, but they didn't push through the thicket. And they took a break. It was an L shape. And one company went around the corner, the other one stayed, and they stayed inside that thicket, and they got hit. They lost 22 people, including the battalion commander, the XO, executive officer, and the command sergeant major. They were all casualties. And he got distinguished, and we came up. We heard the firefight. We just broke and ran and got to them as best we could. We came in kind of as a rescue to further put down fire and to help out, deal with the carnage that was in front of us. I don't know how many were wounded. There was a lot. Because the snipers tied themselves in trees with ropes, and they're right above them. I never looking up, seeing the snipers up there who were dead by that time, and shooting. But the battalion commander, Colonel Stiegel got the Distinguished Service Cross that day. And one of the guys in Company B got the Medal of Honor that day. He dove on a Claymore mine and saved a bunch of people. His name was Stryker, Specialist Stryker, and they named the Stryker vehicle after him. Now, I didn't treat many casualties that day, but I was at that battle, and I saw the carnage. Unbelievable bravery of young men. You have no choice, you just do what you can. And as a sidebar to that conversation, years later, I'm sitting in my living room, maybe 10 years later, I'm watching a television program about the Vietnam War. And I think it was PBS, and they were interviewing different people, North Vietnamese soldiers and whatever. And all of a sudden, this lieutenant, North Vietnamese lieutenant, starts talking about Loc Ninh, November 7th. So well, that rang a bell, so I'm paying attention to him. He was on the other side. He was the one that organized an ambush that killed 22 of our guys that day and probably wounded 30 more. I was just dumbfounded. He lost 500 because they got pushed out into the clearing and the Phantom jets came in and took care of them and killed 500 North Vietnamese that day in that battle. But he was talking about that, and I just sat on my couch watching that program and I wept because I remember being there. What a thing to go through, and to think about, a reflection from his side, his perspective. Remember what I said? It's tough to take somebody's life, but it's their job to take yours, so what do? You're in a war zone, that's what you do. So, but I digress. But I'm sure many of you have stories like this. Anything anybody wants to share here? Particularly veterans, what it's like, you know. I just thank you for letting me share my story. It's pretty neat.
I have one more question.
Yes.
What would you tell a young person today looking into the military?
I would say go for it. You know, again, military is large, 1 million people, right? Even the volunteer military. Not everybody's in combat like that, but everybody has a role to serve to support the combat units. So it's important. And what's the likelihood of you being in combat? Maybe, maybe not. And if you're in combat, what's the likelihood of you survive? Pretty good. Not guaranteed. So I tell young people, if you want to learn about yourself, who you really are, join the military. You don't have to see combat, but you'll learn skills that are useful the rest of your life. And you test your own mettle. You realize what you can accomplish. Because young people never have a chance, maybe they shouldn't, but never have a chance to test their mettle, to see what they're really capable of doing. Oh, this is too hard, I quit. You can't quit the military, or you die. It's that simple. And so you live with these consequences. So I tell them, if you want to learn about yourself, do that. Besides today's military, if you go in as a volunteer, you want to become a doctor, a lawyer, or whatever, they will pay your way to do all of those things. They pay pretty decent wages nowadays, and they also have great benefits. Still a tough life, not quite the same as in society, but you have the pride of trying to help. It's like giving back to your community in a different way. But I tell them, go for it. Do it. You'll be a better person for it. There's no doubt about it. Leroy?
Thank you so much, Bill.
Okay.